My friends at Easy Cater are workplace catering pros, helping you find food for everything from daily employee meals to staff meetings and special events. Visit easycater.com/leaderassistant to find out more.
Hi, my name is Andrew Reeves, and today's leadership quote comes from Stephen Covey. Seek first to understand, and then to be understood.
The Leader Assistant podcast exists to encourage and challenge assistants to become confident, game-changing leader assistants.
The Leader Assistant podcast is brought to you by Goody. If you send business gifts to employees, clients, or sales prospects, Goody is a game changer. You can send one gift or hundreds at a time without ever worrying about shipping details. With Goody, your gift recipients provide all their shipping info, and they can even swap out your gift for another option if they prefer. It's free to start gifting, and you can get a $20 credit when you sign up. Oh, and if you mention you heard about Goody from the Leader Assistant podcast, Goody will add an extra $10 credit to your account. So go to leaderassistant.com/Goody, that's GOODY, to start gifting today. Again, that's leaderassistant.com/Goody. Hey friends, thanks for tuning in to the Leader Assistant podcast. It's your host, Jeremy Burrows, and welcome to episode 177. You can check out the show notes at leaderassistant.com/177. Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Andrew Reeves. Andrew is the executive assistant to the chief operating officer at Reddit, and he's got over 13 years of assistant experience. And I'm just really excited to get to know Andrew and talk with him a little bit today. So Andrew, how's it going?
Not bad, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
What part of the world do you live in?
I'm in New Jersey, the East Coast, so about 30 minutes by car-ish from Manhattan. So definitely got the New York metro vibe happening over here.
Nice. So are you from that area?
Not originally. I'm from southeastern Pennsylvania, about 40 miles outside of Philadelphia, in a town that no one's probably ever heard of called Coatesville. That's where I spent a lot of my formative years. Still consider it home, but I've been in Jersey for about just shy of 20 years.
Nice. And tell us a little bit about yourself. What's one of your favorite hobbies, or what do you like to do when you're not working?
Yeah, so I am a huge book lover. I currently have more new books on my nightstand than I could read at any one time. So there's that. Just recently got married, so spending time with the wife is always a fun way to spend my downtime. And Congrats. Also being creative. Thank you. Also just finding ways to be creative. So I'm a huge vinyl lover. So one could usually find me after work making a martini and throwing on some Miles Davis or John Coltrane, and just having a good time that way and kind of taking a load off from the workday.
That's great. So what books are currently on your nightstand? Is there one or two books that maybe you've started that you're digging?
Sure, yeah. There is Violeta by one of my favorite South American Hispanic authors, Isabel Allende. I'm a huge fan of hers, and I've been reading her books for a number of years. The other one is called The Fourth Man. The name of the author escapes me, but it's pretty much about a fourth suspected Russian mole inside a CIA headquarters back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I'm about a third of the way through the book. It kind of reads almost like a spy novel. So if any of your listeners are into that sort of thing, it's definitely a good read.
Cool. Yeah, definitely check that out. What what got you into the assistant world?
Great question. So I fell into the assistant role sort of by accident. I had just moved to New Jersey and I was temping at a retail organization and they hired a new CMO without looking at my resume, just off of the good word that people put in for me that I worked with. He hired me as his EA back in 2008. And I worked for him for about 7.5 years. Learned a lot. That was a great opportunity to kind of hone the EA craft for myself and kind of figured out what role I wanted to play. So it was a transformative 7 or so years.
Nice. And what's one of your favorite parts about the role?
One of my favorite parts is really solving problems. I love kind of digging into the meat of an issue. A lot of times I've had execs come to me with a particular issue that they're facing, whether it's some, new way that they want to leverage their time or just any other project where there might be headwinds. And I love kind of digging into that, using that context to form relationships with people in the organization. And just really being a thought partner. So I think that, the ability and the empowerment to think outside the box, I think it's the most rewarding part of that role for me.
How do you work with your executive, practically speaking, on the thought partner side of things? What's maybe some tips on how assistants listening can really lean into that thought partner skill set?
Great question. I think it really, first and foremost, takes a measure of purposeful and intentional action on the part of the EA. In most instances that I've experienced, there may not be this, very obvious, I have a problem, how can you help me type of, conversation. Sometimes you have to insert yourself and go looking for them. One example that I have that I can think of right off the bat would be in my role with my current exec. In certain instances, her cognitive load is less at the end of the day. So it's kind of rearranging her calendar so that the most important meetings are earlier in the day when she's freshest, right? So understanding not just how your exec functions and what problems you can kind of foresee, but also kind of paying attention to the nuances and identifying proactively ways that you can lean in and help.
Nice. Yeah, well said. So let's talk a little bit about your current role, Reddit. How did you get into Reddit and what's it like working there?
Yeah, so they actually found me on LinkedIn. That was the first kind of point of contact. I've been working at Bed Bath & Beyond, supporting the chief brand officer for about 9 or so months. And it's interesting because I was really kind of feeling like I wanted a role that would allow me to expand my skill set and kind of take me out of my comfort zone. Hadn't done any hard looking at that point, but as fate or providence would have it, I was contacted by a recruiter at Reddit. Talked to a few individuals and really was excited by Reddit's mission, culture of the company and all of that, and decided to take the leap and haven't looked back, to be very honest.
Were you a big Reddit fan before? Or...
Yeah, interestingly enough, I wasn't. I had been on the platform, for a little bit of time. Not enough to really, have an intimate knowledge of how to leverage the platform. But I will say, since I've been at Reddit, I've definitely taken the opportunity to dive a bit deeper into some of the content and things that I'm interested in. r/vinyl being one of my favorite subreddits nice. For vinyl lovers. So definitely kind of exploring in that sense. But it's good to know how the sausage is made,
Right. And are you all remote fully?
For the most part, yes.
Okay.
So that's presents an interesting opportunity to be more purposeful, but it can also be challenging in the sense that getting in-person time with people, having that in-person cultural kind of connection with your fellow employees. That's kind of lacking a little bit, I feel like, just because of the virtual component. But there are definitely ways that we make up for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's maybe one thing you've learned or about the Reddit culture, the remote environment that you've seen be helpful to combat that for other assistants listening who are also working remotely?
Good question. I think the main thing that's really helped me to leverage that is to be very purposeful about making connections with people. And this may be people in the direct org that a particular exec oversees. It could be cross-functional. It could be fellow EAs. But I think making those purposeful outreaches and saying, hey, want to get time on your calendar, even if it's just to kind of get to know the person better, to understand how their role ladders up into the larger mission of the organization, is super helpful. I think a level of empathy is also important when you think about making connections in a virtual setting, and really kind of making sure that you are listening as much as you are talking. Going back to the Steve Covey quote, seeking first to understand, and then, having your thoughts and your ideas presented. So I found that to be very, very impactful and rewarding, to getting to know people in this kind of virtual environment.
Yeah. So along the same lines, when I ask my guests to kind of book time to schedule an interview for the podcast, I always ask, are there specific topics that you'd like to chat about? And one of the ones that you brought up was emotional intelligence. So
yes,
why did you choose that, and what do you want to talk about?
So again, great question. So I chose this because I feel like, as EAs, at least in my experience, there has not been enough conversation around emotional intelligence, how to leverage it, and really how to use it to become a rock star in your role. So I want to kind of go through, if you're okay with this, Jeremy, kind of the 4 pillars that I've identified that really speak to how an executive assistant or a personal assistant can leverage emotional intelligence to really, make a huge impact in their role.
Yeah, that's great. Let's do it.
Cool. So initially, I think, the giving a bit of backstory around emotional intelligence, there were 2 professors, Peter Salovey and John Mayer. They were, painting their house one day, and they kind of had this really, serendipitous conversation around the link between IQ and emotional intelligence or EQ, and how the emotional part of that has, up until that point, had never gotten a lot of exposure when it came to how a person's intelligence is rated or kind of looked at. So they came together and they kind of put their 2 expertise or disciplines together, and they came up with this idea of emotional intelligence, which prior to that had not been a thing. And the kind of idea or definition that they came up with to identify what emotional intelligence was is the ability to recognize, understand, utilize, and regulate emotions effectively in everyday life. And if you think about it from the perspective of an EA, we are called upon to do that a lot, even though we may not actively know that's what we're doing. So kind of getting into the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence as it relates to the EA field. The first one is maintaining your inner strength. So, this, Jeremy, as an EA, we are pulled in a million different directions. There are so many things vying for our time, and a lot of those things are draining. So there are a few areas and ways that you can kind of keep in mind where your inner strength kind of is, understanding how to maintain it in stressful ideas or stressful situations. One of them is understanding your triggers. And for those who may not know what a trigger is, it's kind of anything that precipitates a very strong kind of negative emotional reaction. So understanding what kind of gets you riled up, what kind of sets your emotions on edge, understanding that about yourself. The next point is managing your feelings about another person's feelings. So there are instances where your executive or your colleagues or cross-functional stakeholders, may have had a bad day. They may come across as, just not in the most talkative of moods if you're, for example, having a call with them, or you may just get this really kind of negative energy from them. So you really have to understand how that person's energy has made you feel, and be able to course correct for that to get the job done. In conjunction with that, Jeremy, there's also this idea of knowing where you are emotionally. So in any given day, there might be issues at home, kids are bothering you, there are stressors that happen outside of work. So I think, the whole idea of leaving all that stuff at the door when you come into the office or when you sit down at your computer, if you're working virtually, that concept really isn't feasible. We're human beings. We all bring things to the office. So just being aware day in and day out where you are emotionally, how you're feeling inside of yourself. And the last part in this maintaining inner strength, Jeremy, is reducing burnout. So I think a lot of us don't really understand when we're burnt out. We're just so used to kind of being in this, fire drill, emergency kind of mode as an EA, that we don't understand when we're burnt out, when we need to take a break, and then also giving ourselves permission to do that. So maintaining inner strength, I think, is very huge when it comes to how an EA can leverage emotional intelligence. The next huge point, I believe, in this process is leveraging diplomacy. So being diplomatic in how you relate to people, how you interact with everyone in different levels of the organization. The first thing that stands out to me on this point, Jeremy, and I've kind of had a lot of experience with this over the past few months, is learning how to respond versus react. And I think that is very important in the sense that it is critical, especially when you are facing issues where you may be triggered by a particular colleague, a coworker, or your executive may trigger you, right? So if you are one of those people like myself who tends to sometimes write emails out of that reactive headspace, it's always good to take a breath before you respond or react rather, and really understand how you need to approach that issue. Reaction comes out of emotion. It comes out of wanting to put your feelings out there. Responding is more calculated, it's more pragmatic, and it's more logical. And more often than not, it gets you the most ROI for the energy that you're putting out there. So even if it's something that your boss may send you that you don't like, a piece of feedback that you're getting from colleagues or managers, always look at that and from the perspective of responding, even if you vehemently don't agree, versus reacting in the moment. I found that to be very, very helpful when it comes to just maintaining my own sanity.
I really like this point.
Yeah.
I think you've said it probably better than I did, but I actually talk about responding versus reacting in my book, and I'm very passionate about that because I've failed many times where I've reacted instead of responding. So yeah, great call out there.
Yeah, you and me both. And I think a lot of us, myself included, tend to learn this lesson the hard way, after reacting in certain instances where, when you step back and look at it in hindsight, you could have responded differently. And I think it's taking those nuggets of learnings and really applying them to every action that you take. The other thing that I would say on this point, Jeremy, is that sometimes that need to understand reacting versus responding happens in the moment, right? So for example, you come in on a Monday morning and the second you sit down at your desk or you turn on your computer, there is an emergency, a fire, something slipped through the cracks, some issue, some problem, right? And then there is always, you didn't see that coming. There's no warning. It just kind of landed in your lap. So in that moment, I feel like the choices that we make in those times are the most valuable when, you have to turn something over as far as a deliverable really quickly. When you are responding to feedback in the moment, when your boss is not really presenting it the right way, those are moments to just kind of in that moment to sit back and say, hey, I need to kind of think about this before I respond to it versus reacting in the moment. So
yeah,
huge point there. I think the other aspect that doesn't get a lot of play in my mind around leveraging diplomacy is the how to say no, right? The way that we turn down something, and it could be anything from taking on an actionable that really doesn't fall within your purview as an EA, so that means respecting your boundaries, or pushing back when, certain individuals are asking for something of your exec that is not realistic or does not align with your executive strategic objectives. One thing that I've done, I think, in saying no, there is definitely a level of empathy that is needed here, because it really does, mean that you have to look at that situation, the person who is asking for time or whatever it is from your exec, look at the situation through their eyes, right? So I've had instances where, there were high demands from my boss's time. And I knew, just based on knowing her objectives, her strategic goals, that this didn't fall into the pecking order of something that was high priority. So what I did was, instead of having my exec meet with them, I met with them to understand what the context was, what headwinds they were facing, and how they, what feedback they needed from my exec. And if I could facilitate that in some other way than hogging up an hour or a half an hour of her time for a call that could be, done async or through a doc or answering questions in that manner. So it really is thinking outside the box to see how you can, allow that individual to feel like they're not just being pushed to the side, that their, ask isn't important, but also prioritizing your person's time. I think the other important point here, and the last one under diplomacy, Jeremy, is inspiring others to action. I feel like in a lot of ways, executive assistants are called upon to influence without authority. So how we do that is very important when it comes to inspiring others to get things done when you don't have the authority behind it to back you up that your boss has, for example. And how you approach that is very, very important. There are two other points, Jeremy, one being relationship management. So how you manage your relationships throughout the organization. I once heard someone at Reddit say or speak on the importance of vibing outside your tribe. And what that means is, connecting with people, especially in a virtual environment that don't fall into the realm of your everyday, the little circle or larger circle of people that you interact with. If you're an EA, for the C-suite or someone, a little further down skip level, talk to someone in a different function, understand what their headwinds are, just kind of stepping outside your comfort zone to talk to people either that may intimidate you or may seem like they, are too high up for you to be asking for their time. Take the risk, reach out, and you'll find, as I have in a lot of ways, very surprisingly, that these people are excited to talk to you, to share what their experiences are. So that's one, I think, very important aspect. The other one being as I kind of alluded to earlier, being purposeful about inserting yourself. So not just kind of flying under the radar, not that flying under the radar and just kind of doing your job, if that's what you have the bandwidth for, isn't ideal. But I think if you really want to grow, if you want to be seen, not just by your exec, but by others in the organization as a safe pair of hands, as someone that can be contacted for help, it's important to form those connections. Being an introvert, as I am, Jeremy, that process for me was extremely triggering.
But I can relate. I'm an introvert as well. So.
Exactly. So, if you can get over the hump of that initial kind of fear or anxiety around putting yourself out there, you'd be surprised how much ROI or benefit you can gain from that. As you know, Jeremy, one of our superpowers as EAs is our network. Our ability to, go to different people, to seek information, to connect, to understand how, certain functions ladder up to the broader org. So, putting yourself out there is hugely, hugely important. And this kind of segues into the last point around relationship management, which is building partnerships. And one of the ways that I have leaned into building partnerships, especially within the organization that my executive oversees, is to figure out where the gaps are and try to understand where I can help. So for example, there was, when I first joined Reddit, I may have been at Reddit for a couple of months, and there was a organization under my boss that didn't have a leader at the moment. So I made sure that I stayed close to the people in those in that org, just to understand what their headwinds are, to understand how they were feeling in the role, to kind of gain knowledge around, certain things that might not be on my executive's radar that I might need to clue her into. So when you talk about, looking out for your exec's blind spots and kind of looking to find headwinds that may not be an issue yet, this is one of the most amazing ways to do it, is to build those partnerships inside your organization, have conversations and so on. The last pillar, Jeremy, is empathy. And this might kind of go without saying, obviously empathy is hugely important in business environments, but I feel like there definitely needs to be more light kind of shown on this part, because it really is a superpower if you leverage it correctly. The one thing that I will say, the first point that I had was, seeking first to understand. I don't know if you've read Stephen Covey's book, but some of the concepts that he outlines in, 7 Habits for Highly Effective People really does kind of lend itself to the EA path as well. And I think, one of those is, reprogramming how you interact in a conversation. A lot of us listen to respond, not to understand. So it's kind of changing that paradigm for yourself to really understand where that person is coming from. And this may apply to your executive as well. Especially when it comes to certain things that may have happened. They may have come off of a long trip and they're grumpy. How would you feel in that situation, right? So it's putting yourself in their shoes to understand and be able to not take offense to the energy that they're bringing, but understand why they're showing up that way. The other point, I think, also is assuming positive intent. So just coming to the table, understanding that everyone is working toward the goal of making the organization better. And even if you are, if it's an email or whatever, if you're reading a certain tone in someone's response, if the energy that you're getting off of someone over a Zoom call or in person kind of hits you in a wrong way, try to assume positive intent. Maybe it isn't about the fact that they don't like you or they don't want to connect or they don't want to talk. It could be something going on that you don't know about. So just kind of keeping that in the back of your mind, as obvious a point as that may be. I think the last point on empathy, Jeremy, is really allowing people and helping people to feel seen and heard. And as I alluded to before, if there are people inside of the organization where your boss just does not have the time to connect with them for whatever reason. I have found it hugely impactful, again, to have a conversation as the EA with them myself to understand what's going on. And in a lot of ways, they appreciate that almost as much as connecting with the executive. So again, it's about being purposeful. It's about being, very intentional in how you're showing up. But in short, Jeremy, those are the 4 pillars. So managing inner strength, using diplomacy, managing relationships, and leveraging empathy.
Wow, that's great, Andrew. That's I'm over here taking a bunch of notes. Great.
Very cool.
Love it. So that's definitely a passion of mine, and is when I'm talking to assistants about future-proofing their role. I talk about 2 things. I talk about AI and automation and embracing automation, but I also talk about cultivating and developing your emotional intelligence. So I really appreciate how you broke that down. That's very valuable information for everyone listening, and myself included.
Absolutely.
Cultivating our emotional intelligence is a huge part of setting ourselves up for a long, successful career as an assistant.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So how I'm going to ask to kind of wrap things up, I'm going to ask a question I like to ask most of my guests. And you've obviously gone pretty in depth into the emotional intelligence side of this, but what's something else maybe in your mind that makes an assistant a leader? And you can't say emotional intelligence.
I think, one of the things in my mind that sets up an executive assistant to be a really amazing leader is their ability to handle change. I know for myself, I abhor change, just innately speaking. But as an EA, there are many instances where things are constantly changing, constantly in flux. And I think being able to roll with those punches is hugely important. I feel like when, certain people in the organization, could be your boss, could be, skip level execs, where, there might be these, fires that you may need to help put out, things of that nature. The ability to stay emotionally even and to internally accept the change, even if you resist it physiologically, is hugely important. I think if you are able to do that effectively, you are seen as someone in the organization who is valuable, who is resourceful, and who kind of, steps away from the usual chaos that kind of happens inside of organizations sometimes. So being able to navigate that, being able to pivot on a dime when necessary, even if to you that pivot doesn't make logical or logistical sense, being able to roll with that punch and course correct on the fly is hugely important. And the more you can do that, the more you can do that with an even temperament and with a positive attitude, the more valuable you'll be to the organization.
Well said, man. Well said. I appreciate you again being on the show. Lots of
absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And how can people reach out if they want to say hi?
So my email is they can reach out to me that way, rareevesjr@gmail.com. I'll give this little nugget. I'm in the very, very early stages of creating a blog. Nothing kind of solid yet, but that's been a passion of mine for a while. So nice. Look out for more on that. But for right now, email is the best way.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I'll make sure to put that, and I'll go ahead and put your LinkedIn URL.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. That's a good way too.
Yeah, in the show notes at leaderassistant.com/177, leaderassistant.com/177. For those listening, if you want to reach out and connect with Andrew, But yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks again. Hopefully we'll get to meet someday in the New York area in the future, and appreciate your work and your passion for the emotional intelligence and the EA community, and looking forward to seeing your, forthcoming blog and reading that and staying in touch.
Sounds good, Jeremy. Thanks again for having me. Definitely very passionate about helping EAs and myself to be better at what we do, and all of that. So thanks again for having me. It's been a real honor.
Please review on Apple Podcasts. GoBulls.com